Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The scream that tore from Ben Rodriguez's throat at exactly 3:47 in the morning wasn't entirely his own. It came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from a primitive part of his brain that recognized wrongness on a cellular level, the way prey animals sense predators lurking just beyond their vision. His hands trembled as he stared at his left palm in the dim amber light of his quarters aboard the deep space cargo hauler, watching beads of cold sweat drip from his forehead onto the metal deck plating below, the jagged scar that had marked his skin for 23 years, the one he'd gotten when his father's circular saw kicked back and caught his 7-year-old hand on a humid Saturday afternoon in July, was gone. Not healed, not faded, gone, as if it had never existed. Ben could still feel the phantom ache of the old wound, the way it used to throb whenever the ship's atmospheric pressure changed during their approach to a new system. He could still remember every detail of that terrible day. The smell of sawdust in his father's garage, the whine of the blade cutting through 2x4s, the moment when the wood caught and kicked the saw back toward his small, curious hands. He remembered the rush to the emergency room in his mother's sedan, his father's face white with panic as he pressed a blood-soaked towel against the wound, his mother's hand gripping his as the doctor prepared to stitch him back together. 14 stitches. He'd counted them obsessively while lying in the hospital bed, tracing the path the needle had taken through his flesh with his fingertip. The scar had been a constant companion ever since, a reminder of childhood curiosity and parental anxiety, of his father's endless apologies and his mother's gentle scolding about being more careful around dangerous tools. But there was no scar. The skin was smooth, unblemished, showing no sign that it had ever been damaged. The palm lines were different too, he realized with growing horror. The lifeline that fortune tellers claimed revealed a person's destiny curved in an unfamiliar pattern, and there was a small mole near his thumb that had never been there before. That wasn't what made him scream though. The tattoo on his forearm read Anna in flowing script, the letters rendered in deep blue ink that had faded slightly over the years to the soft indigo of aged denim. Yesterday, he was absolutely certain it had been yesterday. It had read Amy. He'd gotten it the day after his sister's funeral, sitting in a dingy parlour on the south side of Chicago, while tears streamed down his face and mixed with the blood from the needle. The tattoo artist had been a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, with kind eyes and sleeves of intricate artwork covering both arms. Angels and demons locked in eternal combat, roses blooming from thorns, script in languages Ben couldn't read but that seemed to tell stories of love and loss and redemption. She'd held his hand steady while he sobbed, whispering reassurances in accented English as the needle bit into his skin, like a mechanical bee. For Amy, he'd whispered through the tears, his voice breaking on her name. She'll always be with you now, mijo, Rosa had replied, wiping away the excess ink to reveal the perfect script. The ones we love never really leave us, they just change address. Now it said Anna. The same font, the same fading, the same slight smudge where his shirt had rubbed against it while the tattoo was still healing 6 years ago. Everything was identical except for the name itself, as if someone had carefully erased 4 letters and replaced them with 4 others, maintaining the precise spacing and style. Ben stumbled backward, his bare feet slipping on the condensation that always accumulated on the floor. During the ship's night cycle, the artificial gravity generators created minute temperature fluctuations that caused moisture to bead on every metal surface, turning the deck into a treacherous skating rink for anyone foolish enough to walk around without proper footwear. His reflection caught in the small mirror mounted above his regulation sink. And for 3 seconds that felt like hours, a stranger stared back. The features were similar but wrong. Sharper cheekbones that cast different shadows across his face. Eyes a shade of brown he had never seen in any mirror. Irises flecked with gold that seemed to shift and move in the amber light. A nose that had never been broken during that disastrous high school football game against the Riverside Ravens, when Tommy Morrison had tackled him so hard that the impact had left him tasting copper for a week. Then reality snapped back like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point, leaving him gasping and dizzy, his own familiar face looking back at him with wide, terrified eyes that reflected his confusion and growing panic. The walls of his quarters felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. The same gunmetal grey paint that covered every surface on the ship, applied in regulation thickness according to colonial authority specifications. The same narrow bunk with its scratchy synthetic sheets that smelled faintly of industrial detergent. The same built-in desk with its collection of personal items, a photo of his family, a small cactus he'd bought on Lunar Station, a worn paperback copy of Dune that had belonged to his grandfather. But the shadows fell differently, as if the light sources had been moved by invisible hands during the night. The air tasted metallic, charged with an electricity that made his molars ache and set his nerves on edge, like fingernails on a chalkboard. Even the constant hum of the ship's engine seemed pitched differently, vibrating through his bones at a frequency that felt alien and disturbing, as if the very atoms of the vessel were oscillating out of phase with reality itself. Ben pressed his palm against the cool metal wall, trying to ground himself in something solid and real. The Nightfall was a Horizon-class cargo hauler, built in the lunar shipyards 37 years ago, one of the workhorses of the colonial freight industry. She was showing her age in the way that deep space vessels always did. Conduits that sparked when the gravity generator cycled through its maintenance routine, atmospheric recyclers that wheezed like an old man's lungs, hull plating that had been patched and repatched so many times it looked like a quilt made of mismatched metal. But he loved her for all her flaws and quirks. Every bolt, every wire, every idiosyncratic system failure was familiar to him after 6 months of keeping her running. He'd been aboard since the beginning of their current cargo run, working as a maintenance engineer on what should have been a routine delivery to Europa Station. The pay was decent, the crew was good people, and the work kept his hands busy and his mind off the grief that still occasionally blindsided him when he least expected it. Amy had been dead for 6 years, but sometimes he would still reach for his comm unit to call her before remembering that her number would never be answered again. Sometimes he would see something that would have made her laugh, a ridiculous advertisement on a trade station, a particularly dramatic space battle in one of the action movies the crew watched during their off hours, and the urge to share it with her would hit him like a physical blow. So why did everything feel like a lie? Ben grabbed his work tablet from the small desk built into the wall and pulled up the ship's schematics with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. The blueprints showed the same layout he knew by heart. Cargo bays stacked like building blocks in the ship's belly. Crew quarters arranged around the central hub. The cramped bridge where Captain Cole spent most of his waking hours. The engineering section where Ben spent most of his, surrounded by the humming machinery that kept them all alive in the void. But something was wrong with the header information. The ship's name at the top of the document read Darkside, in the same standardized font used for all colonial authority documentation. Ben blinked hard, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his palms until colored spots danced behind his eyelids. When he looked again, it still said Darkside. He scrolled through screen after screen of technical documentation, maintenance schedules, crew assignments, cargo manifests, all of it bearing the wrong name. According to these files, he'd been working aboard the dark side for the past 6 months, not the Nightfall. "No," he whispered to the empty room, his voice sounding strange and hollow in the recycled air. "No, that's not right." He accessed his personal files with growing desperation, looking for some evidence that he wasn't losing his mind. His employment contract bore the letterhead of Darkside Shipping Consortium, a company he'd never heard of before. His crew assignment paperwork listed him as a maintenance engineer aboard the DSC Darkside, reporting to Captain Cole Morrison, but Cole's last name was supposed to be Patterson, not Morrison. Even his personal journal entries, written in his own distinctive handwriting with its characteristic loops and flourishes, consistently referred to the ship by that alien name. But he remembered the Nightfall. He remembered the day he'd signed his contract, standing in the hiring office on Lunar Station while the recruiter, a tired-looking woman with coffee stains on her uniform, explained the mission parameters and warned him about the psychological challenges of deep space isolation. He remembered walking up the boarding ramp for the first time, the way the name Nightfall had been stenciled in faded letters across the airlock door, the registration numbers that he'd memorized within his first week aboard. Ben burst from his quarters and ran through the ship's narrow corridors, his bare feet slapping against the deck plating with each frantic step. The familiar route to the medical bay seemed different somehow. The corridors stretched longer than they should, extending into distances that defied the ship's actual dimensions. The perspective was wrong, as if he were looking through a funhouse mirror that distorted space itself. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow that he didn't remember being quite so harsh, and the air recycling units hummed with a pitch that set his teeth on edge and made his inner ear ache. The walls seemed to breathe around him, expanding and contracting with each heartbeat, as if the ship itself had developed a pulse. The medical bay was where it had always been, tucked between the galley and the recreation area in the ship's central hub. But when Ben burst through the door like a man fleeing from demons, Dr. Max Hoffman looked up from his supply inventory with the blank expression of someone seeing a complete stranger. "Can I help you?" Max asked, politely, setting down his tablet and turning to face Ben with the professional courtesy of a man accustomed to dealing with crew medical emergencies at all hours. The words hit Ben like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Max was 62 years old, a former military medic with greying hair and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent finding humour in the darkest places humanity had to offer. He'd served 3 tours in the Martian conflict before retiring to civilian life, trading battlefield medicine for the relative quiet of deep space cargo runs and the modest salary that came with keeping freight crews healthy and functional. They'd shared hundreds of meals together over the past 6 months, sitting in the cramped galley while the ship's recyclers hummed around them. They'd swapped stories about their families and their fears, complained about the ship's lousy recycled air and the way the gravity generator made everything taste like metal. Max had told him about his ex-wife Sarah, about how she'd left him because she couldn't handle the nightmares that came with treating wounded soldiers, the way he would wake up screaming about arterial blood and the smell of burned flesh. He talked about his daughter Lisa, who lived on Mars Colony 7, and wouldn't speak to him anymore because he'd missed too many birthdays and school plays and graduations while he was deployed. He'd shown Ben pictures of his grandson Tommy, a gap-toothed 8-year-old who wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up, and sent his grandfather drawings of rocket ships and alien planets rendered in crayon. Max had also confided his struggles with arthritis, the way his hands had started to shake during delicate procedures, forcing him to rely more and more on the ship's automated medical systems. Just last week, he'd asked Ben to help him replace a faulty servo in the surgical unit, his pride warring with his practicality as he admitted he needed assistance with tasks that had once been second nature. Max, it's me. Ben Rodriguez. We've been working together for months. You told me about your grandson Tommy just yesterday, how he lost his first tooth and put it under his pillow for the tooth fairy. I think you have me confused with someone else, Max said, backing away slightly, his hand moving instinctively toward the emergency comm panel. I've never seen you before in my life. Are you supposed to be on this ship? Do you have authorization to be in the medical bay? Ben's vision blurred, and for a moment he saw the medical bay differently, smaller, with different equipment arranged in an unfamiliar configuration. The walls were painted a different shade of white, almost cream-coloured, and the examination table was positioned at an angle that made no sense given the room's layout. Medical supplies were arranged differently on the shelves, and there was a window showing stars, where there should have been a solid bulkhead. Then everything snapped back to normal, leaving him nauseated and disoriented, his inner ear screaming that something fundamental about the laws of physics had just been violated. You know me, Ben insisted, desperation creeping into his voice like poison. We talked about your arthritis just last week. You showed me the medication you take for the pain, those little blue pills that help with the inflammation. We discussed upgrading the medical bay's diagnostic equipment because the current systems are too old to interface properly with your neural implants. Max's expression shifted from confusion to genuine concern, the look of a medical professional recognizing the signs of a psychological emergency. Son, I think you might be having some kind of episode. I don't have arthritis, and I certainly don't have any neural implants. The medical bay equipment is state-of-the-art, installed just last year during our refit on Lunar Station. I think you need to sit down and let me run some scans. No, Ben said, backing toward the door. No, this is wrong. This is all wrong. He turned and ran from the medical bay, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The corridors seemed to shift around him as he moved, walls sliding past at angles that didn't match his memory of the ship's layout. The perspective kept changing, as if he were running through a maze designed by someone who had only heard descriptions of three-dimensional space. Ben burst onto the bridge where Zoe Nakamura should be running final approach calculations for their arrival at Europa Station in 3 days' time. She was there, hunched over the navigation console with her characteristic intensity, her black hair pulled back in the same messy bun she always wore while working. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface with the fluid grace of someone who had been navigating deep space for over a decade. But when she turned around, her smile was too bright, too familiar, carrying a warmth that suggested years of close friendship rather than the professional camaraderie they'd actually shared. Her dark eyes held recognition and affection that felt unearned, as if she were looking at a beloved brother rather than a crew member she'd known for only 6 months. "Morning, Ben," she said cheerfully, her voice carrying a slight accent that he'd never noticed before, something that suggested she'd grown up speaking Japanese before learning English. "Ready for our final approach to Titan Base? I can't wait to get off this rust bucket and feel real gravity again. My bones are starting to ache from all this artificial grav." Ben's mouth went dry. Titan Base was a research facility on Saturn's largest moon, dedicated to studying the complex hydrocarbon cycle and methane lakes that made Titan one of the most fascinating worlds in the solar system. It was run jointly by the Earth Colonial Authority and the Martian Science Consortium, staffed by xenobiologists and atmospheric specialists who spent years at a time in the frigid environment. Europa Station was a mining colony built into the ice sheets of Jupiter's fourth largest moon, focused on extracting water and rare minerals from the subsurface ocean that harbored some of the most exotic life forms ever discovered. The two destinations were separated by hundreds of millions of kilometers and completely different mission parameters. They were as different as New York and Tokyo, requiring entirely different flight plans, crew certifications, and equipment loadouts. Titan Base, Ben managed, his voice cracking. "We're going to Europa Station. We've been talking about it for months. You were excited about seeing the ice geysers, about getting some water samples for your cousin Elena, who works in the xenobiology department on Mars." Zoe's smile faltered, replaced by genuine concern. Her dark eyes searched his face with the intensity of someone trying to diagnose a malfunction in a critical system. "Ben, are you feeling all right? We've been heading to Titan Base since we left Earth orbit 8 months ago. It's in all the mission briefs, all the navigation logs. I've been planning our approach vector for weeks." 8 months? Ben's voice cracked like a teenager's. "We've only been out for 6 months, and Elena doesn't work in xenobiology. She's a teacher on Mars Colony 7. She teaches elementary school kids about Earth history." "Ben, you're scaring me," Zoe said, standing up from her station and taking a step toward him. Her movement was fluid, graceful, but there was something wrong about the way she moved, as if she were performing actions she'd rehearsed but never quite perfected. "Your cousin Elena works in the xenobiology department at Titan Base. We've been talking about visiting her when we arrive, about how excited she is to show you her research on titanian microorganisms. Are you having memory problems? Did you hit your head during your shift?" Ben stumbled to the main computer terminal and pulled up the mission logs with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. His own handwriting filled the screen, but the words were all wrong. According to these logs, they'd been traveling to Titan Base for 8 months, not 6. The crew manifest showed he'd been aboard the entire time, working alongside people he'd supposedly known for nearly a year. But he didn't remember any of it. The mission details were wrong. The destination was wrong. The timeline was wrong. But it was all documented in his handwriting, stamped with his biometric signature, sealed with his personal encryption key that only he knew, a combination of his mother's maiden name and the coordinates of his childhood home. He scrolled through entry after entry, watching his own words describe events he'd never lived through. Shore leave on Lunar Station that had never happened, where he'd supposedly met a woman named Carmen and spent 3 days exploring the underground markets. Equipment failures he'd never repaired, including a catastrophic cooling system breakdown that had required him to spend 18 hours in an EVA suit making external repairs. Conversations with crew members he barely knew, described with the intimacy of old friends who had shared years of experiences together. According to these logs, he and Zoe had developed a close friendship over their months together, bonding over their shared love of old Earth music and their homesickness for real weather. He'd supposedly helped her through a difficult period when she received news that her father was dying, staying up all night listening to her talk about childhood memories and regrets. But Ben didn't remember any of it. The Zoe he knew was professional, competent, friendly but distant. They'd shared polite conversation and mutual respect, but nothing deeper than the surface-level camaraderie that developed between people working in close quarters. Captain Cole emerged from his quarters and Ben felt another shock of disorientation. Cole was still tall, still grey-haired, still carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had commanded vessels in the deep black for decades. But his face was different, rounder with different lines around his eyes, a scar on his left cheek that Ben had never seen before. "Morning, team," Cole said, his voice carrying the same gravelly tone Ben remembered, but pitched slightly differently, as if it were coming from a throat that had experienced different sorrows. "Rodriguez, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" Captain," Ben said, struggling to maintain some semblance of military courtesy while his world crumbled around him. "Something's wrong. Yesterday our ship was called the Nightfall. Today it's the Dark Side. Yesterday we were going to Europa Station. Today everyone says we're going to Titan Base. Yesterday Max knew who I was, and now he's treating me like a complete stranger." Cole's expression shifted from concern to alarm. He exchanged a quick glance with Zoe, the kind of wordless communication that developed between people who'd worked together in dangerous situations where Split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death in the void. "Ben, you're scaring me," Cole said, using his first name instead of his rank, a familiarity that felt both comforting and wrong. "You wrote these mission logs yesterday evening. I watched you input them into the system during your duty shift, just like you have every day for the past 8 months. The ship has always been called the Dark Side. I've been her captain for 3 years now. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" Ben spun around, taking in the familiar yet wrong surroundings. The bridge was the same basic configuration he remembered. Pilot station, navigation console, communications array. Captain's chair positioned to oversee everything with maximum efficiency. But the details were all wrong, as if someone had taken a photograph of the real bridge and painted over it with slightly different colours. Different coloured buttons on the control panels, their surfaces worn smooth by hands he didn't remember touching them. A navigation screen that showed star charts he didn't recognise, displaying constellations that seemed subtly off from the ones he'd been using to navigate for the past 6 months. The captain's chair was positioned 3 feet to the left of where it should be, facing a communications console that had additional equipment he had never seen before. Banks of monitors and signal processors that looked years more advanced than anything the Nightfall had carried. Even the smell was wrong. Every ship had its own unique scent, a combination of recycled air, metal polish, electronics, and the distinctive odours of the crew who lived and worked within its hull. The Nightfall had smelled like coffee and machine oil, with an undertone of ozone from the aging electrical systems and a faint hint of the lavender soap that Zoe used in her quarters. The dark side smelled like antiseptic and something else he couldn't identify, something organic and slightly unpleasant that reminded him of hospitals and laboratories. The air felt different in his lungs, as if it had been processed by different recycling systems with different specifications. "I need to go to my quarters," Ben muttered, backing toward the bridge exit. "I need to think." But when he reached his room, it wasn't his room anymore. The layout was similar, the same cramped dimensions dictated by the ship's design specifications, but everything was subtly wrong in ways that made his skin crawl. His personal belongings were there, arranged exactly as he liked them, but they weren't quite right. Photos of his family showed people who looked like his parents and sister but weren't quite them. His father's face was rounder, his hairline different, his smile missing the slight gap between his front teeth that had always made him self-conscious about photographs. His mother's hair was a different colour, auburn instead of brown, and she was wearing jewellery he'd never seen before, delicate silver earrings that caught the light in unfamiliar ways. The girl who should have been Amy was Anna, alive and radiant, wearing a graduation cap from Columbia University. Ben had never seen this photo before, but it was displayed in the same frame that had once held a picture of Amy blowing out candles on her 16th birthday cake, the last birthday she'd ever celebrated. Ben picked up the photo with trembling hands, studying every detail with the desperate intensity of a detective examining evidence. Anna looked happy, genuinely joyful, standing between two people who were supposed to be his parents but weren't quite right. The background showed a campus he didn't recognize, with buildings that seemed familiar but wrong, as if someone had taken his memories of Columbia and painted over them with slightly different architectural details. Anna was beautiful, in the same way Amy had been, the same dark hair, the same bright smile, the same dimple in her left cheek that appeared when she laughed, but her eyes were different, a shade of green that Amy's had never been, and there was a small scar above her right eyebrow that told a story Ben had never heard. He opened his personal logbook, the physical notebook he'd kept since childhood as a way of processing his thoughts and experiences. The leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and the pages were filled with his distinctive handwriting, but the words described a life he'd never lived, growing up with Anna instead of Amy. different schools, different friends, different defining moments that had shaped the person he was supposed to be. According to these logs, he'd never experienced the crushing grief of losing his sister in a car accident on a rainy Thursday night. There was no mention of the phone call that had shattered his world. No description of the funeral that had left him feeling hollow and lost. Instead, he read about Anna's graduation from high school, her acceptance to Columbia University, her struggles with organic chemistry, and her eventual decision to major in education. He read about her first boyfriend, a boy named Marcus who played guitar and wrote terrible poetry, and their amicable breakup when they realized they wanted different things from life. He read about her wedding to a man named David Chen, a software engineer who made her laugh and shared her love of hiking and old movies. There were detailed descriptions of the ceremony, held in a garden outside Chicago on a perfect spring day, with Anna radiant in a dress that had belonged to their grandmother. Most shocking of all, he read about the birth of her first child, his nephew Michael, whose existence was as real in these pages as his non-existence was impossible in Ben's memories. The entries describing Michael's birth were filled with the wonder and joy of a new uncle, complete with details about the baby's weight and length, and the way his tiny fingers had gripped Ben's thumb during their first meeting. The person in these logs was him, but not him. A version of himself who had lived a different life, made different choices, felt different pain. This other Ben had struggled with depression during his teenage years, had gone through a difficult breakup with a girlfriend named Michelle Torres, had chosen to work in space because he wanted adventure, rather than because he was running away from grief that threatened to swallow him whole. Hours passed as Ben read through the logs, each entry feeling like a knife twist in his chest. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Every loop and flourish, every characteristic way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's, the way his letters slanted slightly to the right when he was tired or emotional, but the experiences described were those of a stranger. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he felt like he was falling through empty space. The ship's gravity generator hummed with a frequency that seemed to vibrate through his bones, and the recycled air tasted wrong in his lungs. Too clean, too processed, lacking the familiar staleness that came from being breathed by the same 5 people for months on end. When he finally dozed off, he dreamed of white rooms and voices that weren't quite human, speaking words that reformed reality with each carefully pronounced syllable. The voices spoke in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce, discussing his fate with the detached professionalism of office workers deciding whether to delete a file. Ben woke to the sound of scratching metal. The chronometer on his wall showed 2:15 a.m. ship time. The corridor outside his quarters was dark, except for the emergency lighting that cast everything in harsh red shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The scratching sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the ship, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to echo through the hull plating like fingernails on a chalkboard. Ben pulled on his clothes with movements that felt sluggish and unnatural, as if he were operating his body by remote control. The fabric felt wrong against his skin. Too rough, too smooth, the wrong temperature. Even his own clothes seemed to belong to someone else. He followed the sound through the ship's corridors, noting how they seemed to stretch longer in the darkness. The emergency lighting flickered occasionally, creating moving shadows that made the walls appear to breathe and pulse. The scratching was coming from the outer hull access corridor, where someone was carving something into the reinforced steel, with what sounded like a plasma cutter operating at minimal power. But when Ben reached the corridor, it was empty. The scratching continued, invisible hands working in the darkness with mechanical precision. Ben grabbed a flashlight from the nearest emergency kit and illuminated the wall, his breath catching in his throat at what the beam revealed. Fresh scratches spelled out a message in his own handwriting, The editors are coming. Find the soft spots. B. His blood turned to ice as the beam of his flashlight revealed more messages carved into the metal. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, covering every available surface like the obsessive scribblings of a madman. Some were old and worn, the edges of the letters smoothed by time and the ship's vibrations. Others were so fresh that metal shavings still clung to the edges of the cuts, glinting in the flashlight beam like stars. All in his handwriting, all signed with his initial. Help me remember. B. Amy was real. B. The ship was called Nightfall. B. Don't trust the logs. B. They're rewriting everything. B. I've done this before. B. Break the cycle. B. The universe is a rough draft. B. The plasma cutter lay on the floor beside the newest message, still warm to the touch. Ben picked it up with numb fingers, staring at the tool he had no memory of using, but that somehow felt familiar in his hand. He accessed the ship's security footage through a nearby maintenance terminal, his fingers finding the right commands without conscious thought. Fast-forwarding through the last few hours, he watched himself sleepwalking through the corridors like a man possessed, his movements jerky and unnatural. The Ben in the video carried the plasma cutter with practiced ease, carving message after message into the hull as if following a script written by someone else. But something was wrong with the footage. The Ben in the video moved differently, held his head at an odd angle, spoke words that didn't match his lip movements. And his eyes, even in the grainy security footage, Ben could see that his eyes were wrong. They reflected light differently, as if something else was looking out through his sockets, using his body as a puppet. "What am I?" he whispered to the empty corridor. That's when he found the classified files. Hidden deep in the ship's computer system, behind multiple layers of security that he somehow knew how to bypass, Ben discovered documents that made his blood run cold. File names that shouldn't exist. Project Palimpsest, Reality Revision Protocols, Subject 5, Maintenance Reports. The dark side wasn't a cargo hauler. According to these files, she was a research vessel designated as Project Palimpsest, operating under the joint authority of the Earth Colonial Authority and something called the Revision Oversight Committee, an organization that didn't appear in any public records but whose authority seemed to supersede that of any known government body. The crew weren't workers, they were test subjects. The files detailed something called the Revision Project, a classified program designed to study and manipulate what the documents referred to as reality shadows. According to the research, deep space created zones where the fundamental structure of existence became malleable, where the basic laws that govern space and time could be bent or even rewritten entirely. The project was designed to study how reality could be edited, improved, corrected, like a cosmic editorial process that treated existence itself as a rough draft in need of revision. Ben was listed as Subject 5 with the designation Glitch Entity, retains false memories. The files described him as an anomaly, someone who remembered a version of reality that had been marked for correction. His memories of Amy, of the Nightfall, of his original life, all of it was classified as erroneous data that needed to be overwritten. The other crew members were listed with different designations. Max was Control Subject Alpha, Memory Anchor. Zoe was Revision Monitor Beta, Navigation Specialist, and Cole was Oversight Agent Gamma, Command Authority. Their role was to reinforce the corrected reality and help identify when the revisions weren't taking hold properly. According to the files, entities called editors existed outside normal spacetime, treating reality like a document that required constant proofreading and correction. They moved through the universe, identifying errors, inconsistencies, and anomalies, then carefully editing them out of existence with the methodical precision of cosmic librarians. And they were coming to fix him. Ben felt the ship shudder around him, a vibration that seemed to come from outside the normal dimensions of space. The lights flickered, and for a moment he could see through the walls as if they were made of glass. The void outside wasn't the familiar star-filled darkness of space. It was white, sterile, empty of everything except the massive shapes that moved through it with purpose. Colours began to bleed from one surface to another, like watercolours running in the rain. The corridor stretched impossibly long, then snapped back to normal size with a sound like reality tearing along invisible seams. Through the viewports, space itself looked wrong. Not the deep black he was accustomed to, but a bright, clinical white that hurt to look at directly. Ben ran back to the bridge, his feet echoing strangely on deck plating that seemed to shift between different materials with each step. Metal became rubber, became something that felt organic and warm, then snapped back to familiar steel. The crew was changing. Zoe's face flickered between different people. A blonde woman with sharp features and cold eyes. A dark-haired man with kind eyes and laugh lines. Something that wasn't quite human, but was trying very hard to appear so. Her voice spoke with different accents, different inflections, as if multiple people were trying to speak through the same mouth at the same time. "Ben," she said, but it came out wrong, like an echo of an echo bouncing off walls that existed in dimensions he couldn't perceive. "You need to stop fighting this. You're making it worse for everyone." Max aged 20 years in the span of seconds, his hair turning white, his face creasing with lines that spoke of decades Ben had never seen him live. Then he reverted to being younger, smoother, someone else entirely. A woman with red hair and freckles. Then a man with dark skin and surgical scars. Then something that might have been human once, but had been edited so many times that the original template was no longer recognizable. "Making what worse?" Ben demanded, his voice echoing strangely in the shifting space of the bridge. "The corrections," Cole replied, but his voice came from multiple mouths, spoken by faces that morphed and shifted with each word. His features flowed like liquid, becoming younger, older, different races and genders, as if he were a composite of every possible version of himself that could exist. Reality had a glitch. You were the glitch. They're fixing it. The ship's hull became transparent, revealing the white void outside. In all its terrible emptiness, massive shapes moved in the nothingness, things too large to comprehend, working with tools that existed in geometries his mind couldn't process, the editors. They were beautiful in a way that made his eyes water and his brain ache. Crystalline beings that reflected light that didn't exist, using instruments that reformed matter and energy and time itself with the casual precision of office workers, correcting typos in a document. Each editor was roughly the size of a skyscraper, but their dimensions seemed to shift and flow as they moved, existing in more spatial dimensions than human perception could accommodate. Their tools defied description, devices that looked like geometric impossibilities, instruments that seemed to fold space around themselves, implements that existed as pure concept rather than physical matter. They worked with the methodical efficiency of cosmic librarians, identifying errors in reality's fabric and correcting them with careful, deliberate movements. Words appeared on the walls around Ben, spelling themselves out in burning letters that seared themselves into his retinas. Reality had a glitch. You were the glitch. We are fixing it. The letters glowed with a light that came from no identifiable source, pulsing with each word as if the ship itself had developed a heartbeat. More words appeared, covering every available surface. The ceiling, the floor, the control panels, all written in fonts that hurt to look at directly. Narrative inconsistency detected. Subject 5 retains deprecated memories, implementing corrective measures. Ben's own voice spoke from the ship's speakers, but he wasn't speaking. Your original life was an error in the universe's code. Amy never existed. Your childhood was incorrect. Your pain was a mistake. We are correcting these errors to improve the overall narrative consistency of this reality branch." "No," Ben whispered, then louder. "No, she was real. My sister was real. My pain was real. You can't just edit away the things that hurt." But even as he spoke, he could feel his memories beginning to shift. Images of Amy started to fade around the edges, becoming less vivid, less immediate. Her voice, which he'd been able to recall perfectly just hours ago, now sounded distant and distorted, like a recording played through faulty speakers. The editors communicated through the ship itself. Every surface became a canvas for their words, burning letters that appeared and disappeared faster than he could read them. Suffering serves no narrative purpose. Error creates inefficiency. We optimize, we improve, we perfect. Subject 5 shows unusual resistance to revision, implementing deep restructure protocol. Ben felt his body beginning to change. His memories started to dissolve more rapidly now, replaced by new ones that felt just as real, but weren't his. He remembered growing up with Anna instead of Amy. Remembered family dinners where she talked about her classes at Columbia. Remembered helping her study for her teaching certification exams. Remembered dancing at her wedding to David Chen in that garden outside Chicago. But underneath it all, the original memories clung desperately to existence like drowning victims, fighting for air. Amy's laugh, high and musical, infectious in the way that made everyone around her smile, even when they were having their worst day. The sound of tires on wet pavement that still made his heart race 6 years later. The weight of dirt hitting her coffin as he stood beside the grave in a suit that was too big for his 17-year-old frame, listening to the pastor recite words that meant nothing to him. "I won't let you erase her," Ben said, grabbing the plasma cutter from where he'd left it on the bridge. He began carving frantically into the ship's hull, creating a breach that opened into the white void. The editor's attention focused on him like a spotlight made of pure thought, and he felt their presence pressing against his mind with the weight of cosmic authority. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to stare directly into the sun while it examined him back. He could feel them cataloguing every thought, every memory, every emotion, sorting through his consciousness like archivists organizing old documents. Through the breach, he could see them clearly now. They weren't malevolent creatures driven by cruelty or hatred. They were cosmic librarians, maintaining the universe's consistency with the same detached professionalism of office workers fixing grammar errors in important documents. They carried tools that existed in dimensions Ben couldn't perceive, editing reality with the casual efficiency of copy editors, removing redundant passages from a manuscript. To them, he wasn't a person with hopes and fears and dreams. He was a typo that needed correction, an error in the cosmic text that disrupted the flow of the narrative. "You can fix reality," Ben said to the void, his words echoing strangely in the space between dimensions. "But you need someone to monitor the repairs, someone who can see the seams where you've stitched things together." The pressure in his head increased as the editors considered his proposal. He could feel them examining him more closely, weighing his usefulness against the resources required to keep him functional. Their attention was like surgery performed with instruments made of pure concept, invasive, precise, utterly without mercy. "Let me remember both versions," Ben continued, blood streaming from his nose as their attention bore down on him. "The error and the correction. I'll be your agent, I'll watch for new glitches, mark them for revision. But let me keep some part of what I was..." The white void pulsed with consideration, and Ben felt the weight of cosmic judgment settling over him like a lead blanket. The editors were deciding his fate with the same careful deliberation they brought to all their work, methodical, thorough, utterly impartial. Then he felt their decision wash over him like a tide of molten metal. Pain exploded through his skull as his memories were forcibly reorganized, sorted, catalogued, and filed according to new parameters. It was like having his brain turned inside out and reassembled by someone who had only heard descriptions of how consciousness was supposed to work. He experienced his life as it had been, with Amy, with his original pain, with all the messy inconsistencies that made him human, and simultaneously, as it should be, with Anna, with different sorrows, with a narrative structure that made more sense from a cosmic perspective. The process was agony beyond anything he'd ever imagined. He felt his personality dissolving and reconstructing, his sense of self being torn apart and rebuilt according to specifications written in languages that predated human speech. He was dying and being reborn simultaneously, his consciousness torn apart and reconstructed according to the editor's precise requirements. But something unexpected happened during the reconstruction. Ben's desperate resistance, his absolute refusal to let Amy's memory die completely, created a kind of cognitive scar tissue. The editor's perfect revision process hit his stubborn grief and bent around it, incorporating his pain into their corrected reality rather than simply erasing it. He became something new, something that existed in the spaces between versions of reality. Part human, part cosmic function, part walking wound in the fabric of existence. The editors had made him their watchman, their early warning system, their quality control inspector in the vast factory of existence. The ship snapped back to normal reality with a sound like thunder. The crew returned to their original forms, but their eyes were wrong. They looked at Ben with a mixture of recognition and confusion, as if seeing a familiar stranger who reminded them of someone they couldn't quite remember. Ben looked at his forearm. The tattoo now read Anna, but he could still see the ghost of Amy underneath, like a palimpsest where previous text showed through the new writing. The letters seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, sometimes spelling one name, sometimes the other. He remembered both sisters now, one who died in a car crash on a rainy Thursday night, one who lived and taught elementary school children about Earth history. Both were real. Both were false. Both were necessary components of the corrected narrative that his existence now served to maintain. And he could feel another glitch beginning somewhere else in the universe. Reality starting to fray at the edges like fabric worn thin by too much handling. The sensation was like a migraine made of pure wrongness. A cosmic toothache that signaled another error in need of correction. Ben picked up the plasma cutter and walked to a fresh section of hull. He began to carve. The editors are coming. Find the soft spots. B. But as he carved, he realized something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The old scratches on the wall, the dozens of messages in his handwriting. They weren't from different versions of himself. They were from the same version, repeating the same cycle over and over again. He looked at his hands, at the plasma cutter, at the message he was carving. How many times had he done this? How many times had he made the same deal with the editors? How many times had he forgotten and remembered and forgotten again, trapped in an endless loop of revision and resistance? The ship shuddered, and Ben felt reality beginning to shift once more. The cycle was starting again. Soon his memories would be reorganized once more. Soon he would wake up screaming about a missing scar, about the tattoo that read the wrong name, about a sister who may or may not have existed. But this time was different. This time, he had retained just enough of his original self to recognize the pattern. The editors had been too efficient in their correction. They had left him functional enough to serve as their agent, but that functionality included the ability to learn, to adapt, to remember. Ben carved one final message below all the others, using the last of his fading humanity to leave a warning for the next iteration of himself. This is not the first time. It will not be the last. Break the cycle. Remember, the universe is a rough draft, and we are the red ink bleeding through from the margins. He paused, then added one more line. Amy was real. Anna is real. Both can be true. The editor's lie. Tomorrow, he would be someone else. His memories would shift again as the editors continued their work, adjusting and readjusting the narrative until it met their exacting standards. But tonight, in the space between corrections, he remembered being human. He remembered Amy's laugh, bright and musical. He remembered Anna's smile, warm and genuine. He remembered being real, and he carved another warning into the metal, knowing that the next version of himself would find it, read it, and face the same impossible choice between truth and correction, between painful reality and perfected fiction. The editors were always watching. Reality was always being corrected, and Ben was trapped in an endless loop of remembering and forgetting, dying and being reborn, human and something else entirely. But perhaps he could find a way to break the cycle. Perhaps he could find a way to preserve something real in a universe where reality itself was just another rough draft, waiting for revision. The universe was a rough draft, and he was the only one who could see the red ink bleeding through from the margins. But red ink, he realized, wasn't just for corrections. Sometimes it was for writing something new,